I'm going to lighten things up a bit today, and definitely feel free to laugh, and do not take me too seriously. So with the intro, the first startup that I ever joined was 20 years ago, and I've never looked back since. It's been one startup after another. And so today's talk, it's going to be from the perspective of working at startups. Currently, I'm involved with building a consumer device for the connected car market. And it's interesting working in that space because something that Darren mentioned in his talk was the flywheel of data. And what's interesting when you're building a device is that you are right at the source of data. So you are creating your own flywheel. And there's a lot of value that you can add to that data, especially when you own it. So it makes it a really neat sort of position to be in. I've been, as mentioned, I've been using AWS since 2008. And back then, I was with a startup out of Victoria. We were building a SaaS solution for Fortune 500 companies. And it was to manage greenhouse gas emissions. So believe it or not, in 2008, right, it was very difficult to convince Fortune 500 companies to give us their data and host it up in the cloud. They had a lot of concerns about security. They had a lot of concerns about who owned the data. And back then, somehow we managed one of the largest defense contractors, Northrop Grumman, to sign on with us. They were one of our first clients. And what was really interesting about that experience was when they made the decision, they then handed us a manual that was about that thick with their security requirements. And the first, I think it was the first 4 or 5 pages, detailed what their password requirements were. And I had never seen anything like this before. We spent, I think it was about 2 weeks just implementing their password policies. But one of the reasons we were able to secure them as a client and convince them that the cloud was safe actually relates back to alert logic. So in their whole security guidelines book, one of the key requirements was that we had to supply a monthly security audit of our system. So they needed a very specific report. It had to check through hundreds of different vulnerabilities. And as a startup, we were a small team of like 10 people. We had no idea how we were going to do this. And after doing some Google searches, we ran across alert logic. So it was in part due to them that we were actually able to land Northrop Grumman. So these days, I'm leveraging serverless. And that's a new experience. It's just been in the last year. So it's been a very interesting experience. And it's actually, overall, it's been a very great experience. So today, with this talk, I thought it would be fun to look at taking an idea and implementing it back in 2012 and compare it to how you could implement it today in 2017. There's basically just going to be some high-level architectures. We're going to talk a lot about how a developer's time gets divided across all the different types of work. And keep in mind, like from the startup perspective, you're typically very resource limited and time limited. So you're trying to always optimize what you're doing. And we're also going to look at a lot of the challenges and how they've changed over the last 5 years. So with that, we'll have an idea of the direction everything's going in and what the future trends look like. So we're going to go back to 2012. And it can be tough to think, what you're doing in 2012 or what was going on. So I'm going to help you out. There was a song that took the world by storm in 2012, and I'll give you a hint. Most people had no idea what the words meant. Exactly. Another hint. So Gangnam Style hit the scene in 2012. And there was also a certain person with big hands that got reelected. And then back in 2012, the company I was with, we had moved a lot of legacy systems into the cloud. But I would say it was more like a half move because we didn't have things automated. We didn't have auto-scaling groups. There was still a lot of monitoring being done, a lot of issues to resolve, a lot of fires to put out. So 2012 for me, I was on call 24/7. But when I did get some time off, I definitely made the most of it. So this was one of the rare times I got to go on vacation. And it was St. Paddy's Day down in Key West, Florida. So it was a fun time. Now, in 2012, mobile apps were becoming very popular. And it seemed like everyone had an idea for an app. So working in the software space, I would often get emails, usually from friends and friends of friends. So just out of curiosity, how many people in here got app idea emails from their friends? So yeah, it happens all the time. So this next slide came from a friend of a friend. His name's Will, and he sent me this idea. So, hope all is well. I have a question for you. I have an idea for an app. It's not a question. And I can't find any similar out there. In a nutshell, it takes a roster, for instance, men's hockey, and keeps track of who brings beer to the next game, as well as who has already done so. We always have 2 guys per game. We do this on paper every Sunday for my team, and it seems like a simple but handy task for an app, and there are thousands of teams out there, and they all drink beer after their games. Anyway, if you have a suggestion, let me know. So there's 2 things that come out of this email. First thing is, I don't think Will knows what a task list is, because that's exactly what he described. Having names on a list, crossing out names for the people that brought beer, and seeing who was next on the list. The second thing that jumps out is he either plays on very large teams or they really like to drink beer because they're bringing 2 cases to every game. So for Will, I responded back and pointed out that he could use a task list for this. And he thought that was a good idea because he hates to use paper so much. But for this talk, we're going to look at, holding a computer in your hand, what else could you have done in 2012 with this idea, leveraging that mobile device? So if we just go for the easiest mobile app possible here, we'll just focus on the team captain. And all the features that you need on this is just to be able to take your team's phone numbers, put it into the app, be able to schedule some messages for when the games are, probably schedule a reminder ahead of time, a couple days ahead of time, and the day of the game, and then be able to automate sending that bring beer message over SMS, and also be able to track who has brought beer and who hasn't. But in doing this, there's always some problems. It sounds simple. So one of the problems is, I don't know about your friends, but with my friends, Trevor, is Trevor there? There he is. Hey, buddy. If it's a hot summer day and they have a cooler full of cold beer, it can be problematic to get from point A, the beer store, to point B, the field. So you need a way to be able to handle when somebody cancels. And unfortunately, in 2012, it wasn't very easy to get a response back from that SMS message, depending who sent it. So if we were leveraging the SNS, the simple notification service, you couldn't really get a response back to handle when someone would cancel. The other issue with this app is the user count is incredibly low because you're only leveraging team captains. And then because you have a small user count and a lot of the messages are automated, the engagement levels very low. So all of that means that at the end of the day, your potential to monetize is extremely low. So this wouldn't be an app that a lot of people would jump after to implement, because at the end of the day, you're probably not going to make too much money with it. But for someone like Will that hates paper, he would still want to go forward with this. So if we look at the high-level implementation, back in 2012, it looks very simple. You've got your phone, you have an app on your phone that you've built, and it communicates with the beer server, which is an EC2 instance that you've stood up. And then you've also got a database instance in RDS. And you leverage SNS to send out the SMS messages. So the 50 there is just for illustrative purposes. All this has to do is access the contacts on your phones, the contact list. And then the server basically talks with the database and sets up the scheduling. Database persists that information, and the database also tracks who's brought beer and who hasn't. So, at a high level, it seems simple. But there's always challenges. So some of these challenges are, if you're going to launch this, you need it to be of some standard, some quality standard. And in order to reach any type of quality, you have to add automated testing. Otherwise, it's very difficult to have confidence in your quality. And if this is going to be secure, back then you would have been rolling a lot of the security yourself. So security as a whole is a lot of work, and it can become a huge time sink. Then you want it to be performant, because no one wants to be sitting around waiting for beer, which means you have to add monitoring and alerting on top of all this. You want to be able to catch problems before they cause outages. High availability. So the only way you're going to achieve high availability is if there's redundancy in the system. And to do that, you've got to add a load balancer, you've got to have multiple EC2 instances, you've got to have a master slave for your database, you've got to be spread across different zones. So there's a lot to it, and it becomes more and more difficult to manage. So in terms of management, you then need a repeatable process to be able to deploy this, to test it, and that again takes away more time from developing the core features, because now you've got to figure out all of these processes. So 2012, there's a long list of challenges. There's a lot of work to do. And I've highlighted the implementing the core features, because in reality, as a business, that's what you want to focus on. But as you can see, back in 2012, you weren't focusing on those core features. You had a whole list of other things to do. So in terms of time, money, resources, it was a very challenging environment to even put out a simple app that may or may not have made much money for you. So this goes into what I call the technology treadmill. And when you go to launch, you're basically hopping on this treadmill. This treadmill can be very difficult to run on, because there's a whole lot of things that you have to constantly be doing, from maintaining your OS, maintaining all of your dependencies, to doing upgrades, to dealing with security patches, because if you are handling all the security of it, somebody has to be watching for all the patches that come out, and then you have to test once you've deployed these patches to your test stage. Then you're doing all your bug fixing and troubleshooting, and it leaves very little time to focus on your new features and releases. So a startup I was with back in 2012, we actually ran into a lot of issues being on this treadmill, and it was a mobile gaming company. So every time that Apple or Android would put out a new version of their OS, we would have to basically stop development on any new features, because we had a very large portfolio of games, and all of those games needed to be updated to work properly on the new versions of the OS. And there was one game in particular that gave us so many problems. So we, back then, we were doing the official version of New York Times Crosswords on iOS. And it's a subscription-based game. So the way we managed the subscriptions originally was leveraging Apple's UUID. So back then, Apple had a unique identifier that you could access as a developer. And then they decided that it was a privacy issue, so they deprecated use of the UUID, and they introduced a transient ID, meaning that it could change at any point in time. So this meant that we lost our ability to track who had a subscription, a paid subscription, and who didn't. So the day we found out about that, we basically had to stop everything we were doing to figure out how we were going to migrate from the old way to the new way and what that solution was going to look like. So imagine, as a startup having to deal with issues like this that come up out of the blue, and you're on this technology treadmill. So when that happens, you really want to make sure you are fit for the treadmill. And if it changes pace, a lot of things can happen very quickly. And a lot of times it's not good things that happen. So you don't want to end up falling flat on your face on the treadmill because it is tough to get back up and you don't want to jump back on straight away. So in 2012, technology treadmill was a big issue and there were constantly things coming up to deal with. So that sort of segues into developer time. And if you look at your development resources, especially in a startup environment, their time is spent across so many different types of tasks. So they are not just focused on writing code. They are focused on putting out fires, troubleshooting, debugging, researching, and being on call. It can be a very tough life to live. And a lot of times it's just not enjoyable after months or years working in that sort of environment. Because what it comes down to is you're wearing so many different hats. And then because you're wearing so many different hats and you have all these competing priorities, and when fires do come up, it feels like you've got all these soccer balls coming at you at once, and it can be very overwhelming. So with this mobile games startup I was with, another thing happened with the Crosswords app. And we were using one database to power a lot of our games. So if a problem happened with one game that was completely unrelated to another game, it could impact the rest of the games. And this would happen from time to time, so it would impact the Crosswords game. And I didn't know a whole lot about crossword puzzle players until this happened. So in our crossword game, we had leaderboards. One of the leaderboards was called your streak. And the streak was how many days in a row had you completed the full crossword puzzle and submitted it. So looking through the database, it just blew my mind at how many players had streaks that were in the thousands, meaning they had completed the New York Times crossword puzzle every single day for years. And when we had an issue with the database from a completely unrelated game, sometimes those streak scores would get set back to 0. So those were bad days. And so the customer support side of things would just blow up because we would get some very irate people writing in about their streak being set to 0. And we had to fix this right away because they were also very vocal, as you can understand if you've invested that much time into your score. So we had a term that we used in-house when this happened, and we would call them streakers. So it is not fun to have to deal with 100 streakers coming at you all at once. And it would completely derail everything else that we had planned. So let's fast forward to 2017. And with 2017, there's definitely a few things that this year is going to be remembered for. So there's a guy with small hands that was inaugurated. And there was an airline company that had a customer service issue. And in 2017, I've been able to, like leveraging serverless technologies, I am no longer on call 24/7. And there's been a lot of changes, especially with Amazon removing a lot of the pain points from the development side. So now I'm actually able to put my feet up and rest on the weekends sometimes. So for the Beer Leaguer app in 2017, there's been a lot of improvements in the different sorts of services you can provide almost out of the box. Some of these features would be team messaging, scheduling where basically like this app would no longer be just for the team captain. You would involve the entire team, and they would be able to get an alert and say if they can bring the beer or not, or if they're going to make the game or not. Also with attendance tracking to see who said they were going to the game and who actually didn't show up. Game notifications. You can put in advertisements and promos. There's a lot of data synchronization you can do. And the other thing is that team captain can actually administer their team from the app. So in terms of problems, there really aren't any problems on the technology side. The only problems you would run into is on the people side, because people are going to start getting exposed using this. And they're probably not going to like it if they get labeled the least reliable teammate. On the benefits side, there's a lot of benefits. All of a sudden, your user count goes through the roof because you're dealing with the entire team. You've got all these features in here that allow for multiple opportunities to engage. And overall, something like this could have a high potential to monetize. So with the implementation in 2017, with the high-level architecture, the one thing you'll see here is that Lambda is really central to everything. The other thing you'll notice is that we're not having to stand up our own instances and manage them. Now, with RDS, that's your database. You could replace that with DynamoDB. But I chose RDS because Amazon's done some interesting things with RDS in the last couple of years, and they introduced essentially their own version of MySQL, and that they built it to leverage everything in the cloud that they have. So if you're familiar with any sort of database, it's typically designed to run on-premise on one computer, and then you can set up your master and slaves. But it was never designed being backed by cloud infrastructure. And so Amazon was able to take a step back and say, well, we have all this infrastructure. How can we make a database better? And with Aurora, they made it so that it will auto-resize up to, I think, hundreds of terabytes. You can do auto-updates for it. For all the minor versions of new releases. And it is dead simple to attach read replicas to it. So it makes it extremely easy to administer a database. And again, they took away all those pain points from dealing even with just straight MySQL with RDS that in 2012 you would have had to deal with. With the rest of Amazon services, you're able to tie them all together using Lambda. So Lambda is what's called a serverless technology, and it basically lets you just focus on the code. And when you deploy your code, you just basically hand it off to Amazon, and they set up the runtime environment to execute it in. So all of a sudden, you're not dealing with all this maintenance and upgrades and security patches. You're just focusing more on the real value, the real logic that's going to make this app what it is. The rest of these services I would also consider serverless because you're not having to do any maintenance on them. So with CloudWatch, you get logging and monitoring out of the box. You can set up alarms to get notified when things start to behave weird. With S3, it's unlimited storage. With the API gateway, that's your interface from your mobile app into Amazon. You've got SNS, and you can do push notifications through that. The other really interesting piece is Mobile Hub. So Mobile Hub is basically Amazon's SDK for mobile apps. One recent thing that they've added, a service, is it's with Cognito, and it's called User Pools. So remember the story about Northrop Grumman, where they handed off that security book, and the first 5 pages was all about password management and the rules for that. Well, User Pools is Amazon's implementation for doing user management, for doing sign up, log in, log out, and also managing a lot of that metadata about users and doing verification that their phone number is correct, their email address is correct. So instead of having to rewrite this whole user management piece, you're able to just leverage what Amazon's done, and they've created a very scalable solution for you. So, sorry, one other thing I was going to mention here is that we have some of this system running in a VPC. VPC is a virtual private cloud, and that gives you a lot of the security that you require. With Cognito and User Pools, they handle the security of being able to authenticate a person and a device so to make sure that the data they're sending is from who it says it's from. And with VPCs, that's probably one of the more challenging pieces of this, is to get that initial setup done properly. So a bit more about Lambda. It's event-driven. Events can come from anywhere. They can come from other Amazon services, and you specify which events will get executed by which Lambda functions you've basically uploaded to Amazon. Amazon manages all the resources needed to run that code, so you don't have to spend any time doing that. And the other really interesting piece is that there's no fixed costs with this. You're only charged for when the code executes. And in a startup environment, this is so important because in your initial phase of taking an idea and implementing it out, your traffic is incredibly low, and you don't want to be standing up entire stacks to be able to do your development on. Being charged just for what you use brings the cost down to next to nothing. And then as you start scaling up, the costs increase in a linear way instead of having to do those steps up every time you need to add more and more instances. So the other nice thing is that a lot of this security pieces of it, Amazon owns. So the OS that your code's running in, they own the security behind that. You still own the security of what's happening to the data in your code, but almost everything else gets offloaded, especially if you're leveraging user pools and Cognito. So benefits, right? No fixed costs. Amazon owns the uptime, the updates. You can glue all these services together quickly and easily. And the other nice piece is that there's a whole deployment process that comes with it. So you're able to have a repeatable process out of the box that also includes rollbacks. You can set up testing stages, dev stages, and your production stage very easily. So basically, what Lambda amounts to is that your developers are now able to spend a lot of their time building the value logic behind your idea. And with the Cognito user pools, I've touched on a lot of this, but I think it's really important to understand that this exists because no developer out there wants to rewrite another user management piece. And the technology treadmill for this looks way better. You're not spending much time on maintenance or upgrades, doing security patches. You're really spending most of your time working on the new features and releases. So these basically, again, Amazon's removing pain points for you, and you're able to stay on this treadmill without falling off. When we look at developer time and focusing on that value logic piece, there's, like, when I look back at 2012, for a 5-day work week, on average, we were spending 1.5 days on the actual value pieces of the code. The other 3.5 days, we were doing everything else. And now in 2017, it's completely flipped. We're spending the majority of our time implementing out these core features, all the value, and spending a very small percentage of our time doing these other things. So, go Jays. So that means your developers are actually able to start hitting a lot of home runs, which is nice. If we look towards 2018, you can see there's this whole trend where Amazon's using Lambda as the glue, and they're also using it as a way to customize any Amazon service out there. So some examples of this: Aurora, stored procedures, you do those using Lambda. With Amazon IoT, you can push Lambda functions out to the edge of IoT devices. And then on CloudFront, which is their content delivery network, you're able to actually execute Lambda functions out on the edges across the world as requests come in. And with API Gateway, there's been a lot of integration with Lambda. So as a whole, your developers are going to be much happier, and you're going to be able to get a lot more done going towards leveraging serverless. But there are definitely challenges. As I mentioned, setting up the initial configuration for your VPC can be a real challenge because it's tough at first to have an accurate conceptual model of how VPCs work with subnets, with your security groups, your route tables, and that there's no visualization in the AWS console for this. So the other side of it is it's early days for some of these services. There's definitely some bugs there, and there's some scaling issues here and there to keep in mind, but those I'm sure are going to be fixed up. So my advice is to definitely, if you're going to leverage serverless technologies, get a consultant in to talk about the VPC design and have that done properly up front. Otherwise, you're going to spend a lot of trial and error time trying to figure everything out there. And in terms of the future, because your costs are lower, you're reducing almost all of your fixed costs. You've got shorter timelines to do development because you're spending most of your time developing this value logic, and the solution scales out of the box. Plus, your developers are happy, they're motivated, they want to spend time developing these fun features. It really opens the door for making niche apps and services. So, and then Amazon's also added ways to monetize these services using the AWS Marketplace. So it's very quick and easy to get a service up and running that you can charge people for, and it costs you nothing. So it allows you to do one thing well, which is the main goal for anyone in technology.